the buried bus for his siblings. And when he opened the door, he began to cry without stopping. Tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. Click the like button, and let's begin the story. Ethan was 13 years old when he learned that being the oldest sibling meant carrying weight no child should ever have to bear. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late September, when two police officers appeared at the door of the small apartment in Aurora, Colorado, where he lived with his parents and his two younger siblings, Sophie, 9 years old, and Lucas, who had just turned 6. The construction accident had been instantaneous, the officers said. A scaffolding collapse at the downtown Denver site, where both his parents worked as day laborers. Neither had survived. Ethan stood in the doorway, listening to words that didn't seem real. Behind him, Sophie clutched her worn stuffed rabbit, and Lucas asked in a small voice when Mom and Dad were coming home. The officers were kind but efficient. They explained that a social worker would arrive within hours to make temporary arrangements. The children would be placed in emergency foster care while the state located suitable long-term placements. That was when Ethan heard the word that changed everything. Separated. Given their ages, the female officer said gently, it's unlikely we'll find a single home that can take all three. But you'll have visitation rights and... Ethan stopped listening. He looked at Sophie, who had started crying silently, and at Lucas, who didn't yet understand what separated meant, but knew from his sister's face that something terrible was happening. In that moment, Ethan made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was not going to let them be torn apart. The social worker arrived 3 hours later, a tired woman in her 40s named Mrs. Patterson, who carried a briefcase full of forms and spoke in the calm, detached tone of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. She explained the process. Emergency placement tonight. Separate homes, probably. Court hearing within 2 weeks to determine permanent custody. The state would do everything possible to keep them in contact. Everything possible. Ethan knew what that meant. Monthly supervised visits, if they were lucky. Phone calls on birthdays. Growing up as strangers who happened to share blood. He nodded at everything Mrs. Patterson said. He signed where she pointed. He helped Sophie pack a small bag with clothes and her rabbit. But while Mrs. Patterson made phone calls in the kitchen, coordinating placements, Ethan was planning something else entirely. That night, while Mrs. Patterson dozed on the couch, waiting for the foster families to arrive, Ethan woke his siblings and whispered the most important words he had ever spoken. We're leaving. Right now. Together. Sophie's eyes widened. Where are we going? I don't know yet, Ethan admitted. But anywhere is better than being separated. Lucas trusted his older brother absolutely. He climbed out of bed without questions. They took only what they could carry. Ethan packed his school backpack with clothes. The emergency cash his father kept hidden in a coffee can, $230, some canned food from a pantry, and the only photograph of their family taken together from a camping trip 2 summers ago, when everything was still normal. Sophie carried her rabbit and a small bag with a change of clothes. Lucas held his favorite toy car and Ethan's hand. They left through the bedroom window at 2 in the morning, climbing down the fire escape into the darkness of a city that suddenly felt enormous and hostile. Mrs. Patterson would discover them missing at dawn. By then, Ethan planned to be far away, though he had no real plan beyond that single desperate goal. Keep them together, no matter what. The first night, they walked east out of Aurora, following the highway toward the open land beyond the suburbs. Ethan knew they couldn't stay in the city. Mrs. Patterson would notify the police, and 3 children traveling alone would be noticed immediately. They needed to disappear into somewhere vast and empty. By sunrise, they had reached the edge of the plains, where suburban developments gave way to scrubland and distant mesas. Lucas was exhausted, so Ethan carried him on his back while Sophie trudged alongside, too tired to complain. They spent the first day hidden in an abandoned gas station, sleeping in shifts, eating crackers and canned peaches. Ethan kept watch, terrified that every passing car was a police patrol. When darkness fell again, they continued east. The second day was harder. Lucas developed a fever. Sophie's shoes gave her blisters that bled through her socks. And Ethan began to understand the terrible reality of what he had done. He had saved them from separation, but he had no idea how to save them from everything else. Hunger, exposure, the simple fact that winter was coming and they had nowhere to go. On the third day, their luck ran out. They were following a dirt road through hill country, trying to reach a town Ethan had seen on a gas station map, when they heard engines behind them. 2 white vans moving slowly, scanning the roadside. Ethan recognized them instantly. Social services vehicles, the kind used to transport children to placements. Mrs. Patterson had found them. "Run," Ethan shouted, grabbing Lucas and pulling Sophie toward a cluster of rocks and sparse vegetation on the hillside. They scrambled up the slope, small stones sliding beneath their feet, thorny bushes tearing at their clothes. Behind them, the van stopped and doors opened. Adult voices called their names, promising safety and help and everything that sounded good but meant separation. Ethan pushed his siblings higher up the slope, away from a road, into terrain too rough for vehicles to follow. They climbed for what felt like hours. Sophie crying from exhaustion, Lucas barely conscious with fever, Ethan's lungs burning as he carried his brother and dragged his sister forward. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath in the thin air of a high desert, Ethan looked back. The vans were distant now, but he could see figures moving on foot, following their trail. They had bought time, but not safety. He turned to assess their surroundings and felt his heart sink. They were on a barren hillside with no shelter, no water, and nowhere left to run. The sun was setting, the temperature already dropping. Lucas was burning with fever in his arms, and Sophie was shivering despite the afternoon heat. Ethan had led them to the middle of nowhere, and now they were going to be found. Or worse, they weren't going to be found, and they would die out here alone. That was when Sophie said something that changed everything. "Ethan, what's that?" She was pointing down the slope, toward a small canyon obscured by scrub brush and fallen rocks. At first, Ethan didn't see anything unusual. Just more desert, more stone, more emptiness. But then he noticed something that didn't belong. A shape, angular, metallic. The back end of a vehicle, partially buried in earth and overgrown with decades of vegetation, as if the ground itself had slowly swallowed it whole. It was a bus, an old yellow school bus, tilted at a steep angle, its rear emergency door barely visible above the accumulated dirt and tumbleweeds that had piled around it over years of abandonment. Ethan stared at it, his exhausted mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A bus, buried, in the middle of nowhere. "Can we hide there?" Sophie whispered. Ethan had no better options. He carried Lucas down the slope, Sophie following close behind, all of them half-sliding through loose gravel until they reached the partially buried vehicle. The rear emergency door was accessible, though crusted with rust and dirt. Ethan set Lucas down gently and pulled at the handle with both hands. It didn't move. He tried again, bracing his foot against the bus frame, pulling with all the strength left in his 13-year-old body. The door groaned, shifted, then suddenly gave way, swinging open with a metallic shriek that echoed across the empty canyon. Warm air flowed out, carrying the smell of old leather and dust and something else. Something that didn't smell like decay or abandonment. It smelled like someone had been there recently. Ethan hesitated, fear warring with desperation. Then Lucas coughed weakly in Sophie's arms, and the decision was made. He climbed through the emergency door into the buried bus, and what he found inside made him stop breathing. The interior was not what he expected. The bus had been gutted and converted into something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something prepared. The seats had been removed, replaced by a carefully organized living space. There were shelves built along the walls, stocked with canned food, bottled water, blankets, and supplies. In one corner stood a small camping stove with fuel canisters. In another, a battery-powered lantern that still worked when Ethan fumbled for the switch. Warm light flooded the space. Along one wall, someone had built a sleeping platform with foam mattresses and clean pillows sealed in plastic. Hanging from hooks were children's clothes in various sizes, as if whoever had prepared this place had anticipated that children might find it. On a small folding table, sat a metal box with a handwritten label. For the child who finds this refuge. Ethan stood frozen, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't an abandoned bus. It was a shelter, prepared, waiting for them. Sophie climbed in behind him, carrying Lucas, and gasped when she saw the interior. "Ethan, what is this place?" "I don't know," he whispered, but he was already moving toward the metal box, his hands trembling as he opened it. Inside were documents, photographs, and a letter written in careful handwriting on yellowed paper. Ethan unfolded the letter and began to read aloud, his voice shaking. "To the child who finds this refuge. My name is Daniel Carter. If you are reading this, it means you are alone, afraid, and desperate for safety. I built this shelter for you. I was once a teacher in Denver, Colorado. I had 3 children, Michael, Emma, and Sarah. They were 8, 10, and 12 when our house caught fire one winter night. I tried to save them. I failed. For 20 years after their deaths, I lived with guilt and grief that nearly destroyed me. But 5 years ago, I realized something. I could not save my own children, but I could prepare a place for other children who had nowhere else to go. This bus was purchased at auction and transported here in secret. I spent 3 years converting it into a refuge, a place where lost children could find safety, supplies, and most importantly, hope. If you are here, you have found what I left for you. In the compartment beneath the driver's seat, you will find more supplies and something else, legal documents that can change your life. I have arranged everything through my attorney, Robert Morrison, in Denver. The documents give any child who finds this bus access to a trust fund I established before my death. The money is not enormous, but it is enough to ensure you will never starve, never be homeless, never be without options. More importantly, I have identified 3 families, carefully vetted, background checked, good people, who have agreed to adopt children in difficult circumstances. They specialize in keeping siblings together, because I know what it means to lose family. The choice is yours. You can stay here as long as you need. The supplies will last for months. Or you can use the documents to claim the help I prepared for you. Whatever you decide, know this. You are not alone. You were never alone. Even in your darkest moment, someone was thinking of you, preparing for you, hoping you would find your way here. I could not save my children, but maybe I can save you. With hope for your future. Daniel Carter, September 2019 inch. Ethan finished reading and looked up at Sophie, who was crying silently. Lucas, burning with fever, had fallen asleep on the foam mattress, finally warm and safe. Ethan folded the letter carefully and sat down, his entire body shaking with exhaustion and emotion he could no longer contain. For 3 days, he had carried the weight of protecting his siblings alone. 3 days of fear and hunger and impossible decisions. 3 days of believing they were completely abandoned by the world. And now, in a buried bus in the middle of nowhere, he had found proof that someone had cared. Someone had prepared. Someone had left a lifeline for children exactly like them. Ethan put his face in his hands and began to cry. Not from despair, from relief, from the overwhelming realization that they might actually survive this. Sophie sat beside him and wrapped her thin arms around his shoulders. "We're safe now," she whispered. "You saved us, Ethan." But Ethan knew the truth. He hadn't saved them alone. Daniel Carter, a man who had lost everything and spent his final years preparing for this exact moment, had saved them. And now Ethan had to decide what to do with that gift. Outside, night fell over the Colorado hills. Inside the buried bus, 3 orphaned children slept together for the first time in days, warm, fed, and protected by the love of a stranger who had died hoping they would find his refuge. But Ethan couldn't sleep yet. He climbed down to the driver's compartment and found the hidden panel Daniel had mentioned. Inside was another metal box, larger than the first. He opened it carefully. Inside were legal documents, thick folders marked with official seals, attorney letterhead, and detailed instructions. There were also photographs of 3 families, each with handwritten notes describing their homes, their values, and their commitment to adopting siblings together. The Miller family in Fort Collins. Teachers who had lost their daughter to leukemia and wanted to honor her memory by helping children who needed a home. The Chun family in Boulder. Immigrants who had built a successful business and wanted to give back by adopting children the system had trouble placing. The Rodriguez family in Colorado Springs. A large, warm household where 4 biological children had specifically asked their parents to adopt siblings so they wouldn't be separated. Ethan studied each photograph, each letter, each promise. These were real people, vetted by Daniel Carter, waiting for children exactly like them. But claiming this help meant trusting the system again. It meant walking into an attorney's office and hoping that the adults in charge would honor Daniel's wishes instead of separating them into different homes. Ethan didn't know if he could take that risk, but he also knew that staying hidden in a buried bus was not a long-term solution. Lucas needed medical care for his fever. Sophie needed school. They all needed stability and a future that extended beyond surviving one more day. For the first time since his parents' death, Ethan allowed himself to think beyond immediate survival. He thought about what his father would have wanted. His father, who had worked construction jobs to provide for them, who had taught Ethan that being strong didn't mean doing everything alone. It meant knowing when to ask for help and when to trust good people. Ethan made his decision. In the morning, he would take his siblings to Denver. He would find Robert Morrison, Daniel Carter's attorney. He would present the documents and trust that the man who had prepared this refuge had also prepared a path forward. It was terrifying, but it was also their only real chance. He climbed back to the sleeping platform where Sophie and Lucas were curled together under clean blankets, their faces peaceful for the first time in days. Ethan laid down beside them, finally allowing himself to rest. Tomorrow, everything would change again, but tonight they were safe. And that was enough. Ethan woke to sunlight filtering through the small windows of the buried bus. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then, the events of the previous days came flooding back. Lucas was still asleep, but his fever had broken during the night. Sophie was awake, sitting cross-legged on the mattress, holding Daniel Carter's letter and reading it again quietly. "Ethan," she said without looking up, "do you think he was real?" "Mr. Carter." "I think this bus is real," Ethan replied. "I think the food and water are real." "So yeah, he was real. Why would someone do all this for kids they never met?" Ethan thought about the letter, about a man who had lost his children and spent years preparing a refuge for strangers. "I think he needed to believe that losing his family could mean something," Ethan said slowly, "that it could save someone else." Sophie nodded, folding the letter carefully. "Are we going to go?" To the attorney. Ethan looked at his little sister, at Lucas sleeping peacefully, at the photographs of the families willing to adopt them together. "Yeah," he said, "we're going." They spent the morning preparing. Ethan found clean clothes that fit them reasonably well. Daniel had stock sizes for children of all ages. They ate canned soup heated on the camping stove. They washed their faces with bottled water and tried to look presentable. Before leaving, Ethan did something that felt important. He found a notebook and pen in the supplies and wrote a message on the first page. To Daniel Carter, "We were 3 kids with nowhere to go, and you saved us. I don't know if you're watching from somewhere, but I want you to know your children would be proud of what you did. We're going to be okay because of you. Thank you." Ethan, Sophie, and Lucas. He left the notebook open on the table, weighted down with a stone. Then they climbed out of the buried bus and began the long walk back towards civilization. The journey to Denver took most of the day. They hitched a ride with a truck driver who asked no questions, then took a city bus using the last of Ethan's cash. By late afternoon, they stood outside the office building where Robert Morrison practiced law. Ethan held the folder of documents Daniel had prepared. Sophie held Lucas's hand. All 3 of them were terrified. "What if it doesn't work?" Sophie whispered. "Then we'll figure something else out," Ethan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But we have to try." They walked into the building and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The law office was small but professional. A receptionist looked up as they entered. her eyes widening slightly at the sight of three dusty children carrying a worn folder. "Can I help you?" she asked carefully. Ethan stepped forward. "We need to see Mr. Robert Morrison. It's about Daniel Carter's Refuge Trust." The receptionist's expression changed immediately. She stood up, her professional demeanor shifting to something more urgent. "Wait here," she said, and disappeared into an interior office. Moments later, an older man emerged. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at the three children, then at the folder in Ethan's hands, and his face transformed. "Dear God," he whispered, "you found it. You actually found the bus." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Robert Morrison's eyes filled with tears. "I've been Daniel's attorney for 30 years, he said quietly. "When he told me what he was building, I thought it was beautiful, but impossible. I never believed anyone would actually find it. He gestured them into his office. Come in, please. You're safe now." Over the next 2 hours, Robert Morrison confirmed everything Daniel's letter had promised. The trust fund was real, $60,000 set aside specifically for children who found a refuge. The three families were real, all still waiting, all still committed to adopting siblings together. And most importantly, the legal documents gave Ethan, Sophie, and Lucas immediate protection from being separated by the state. Daniel was meticulous, Morrison explained. He anticipated every legal obstacle. "These documents grant temporary guardianship to me as trustee until you choose a permanent family. The state cannot override this without a lengthy court battle, and I have instructions to fight any attempt to separate you." For the first time since their parents' death, Ethan felt the crushing weight lift from his shoulders. They wouldn't be torn apart. Someone with power and resources was protecting them. "What happens now?" Ethan asked. "Now," Morrison said gently, "you meet the families. You take your time. You choose where you want to build your new life." He pulled out the three family profiles. All of them know your story. All of them have been waiting years for children exactly like you. Siblings who need to stay together. Sophie leaned against Ethan's shoulder, staring at the photographs. "Can we really choose?" she whispered. "Yes," Morrison said firmly. "Daniel wanted you to have control over your own future. That's why he built all of this." Over the following week, they met all three families. The Millers in Fort Collins were warm and gentle, their home filled with books and the memory of their daughter, who had loved reading. The Chens in Boulder were energetic and ambitious, already planning how to involve the children in their family business and cultural traditions. But it was the Rodriguez family in Colorado Springs that felt like home. Maria and Carlos Rodriguez had 4 biological children ranging from 8 to 15. The family lived in a sprawling house with a large backyard, constant noise, and the kind of chaotic love that reminded Ethan of his own family before the accident. When they visited, the Rodriguez children immediately pulled Lucas into a game, included Sophie in their conversation, and treated Ethan not as a charity case, but as an equal. "We asked our parents to adopt because we wanted more siblings," the oldest Rodriguez daughter, Elena, explained during dinner. "And we specifically wanted kids who needed to stay together because family is the most important thing." That night, after they returned to the temporary foster home where Morrison had placed them, Ethan asked his siblings what they wanted. "I like them," Sophie said simply. "They feel right." Lucas nodded. "They have a dog." And Elena said I could share her brother's room. Ethan felt the same way, but he wanted to be sure. "This is permanent," he said seriously. "If we choose them, we're choosing a new life. New schools. New everything." "We already lost our old life," Sophie said quietly. "This is a chance to build something new. Together." 2 weeks later, they stood in a courtroom as a judge finalized the adoption. Maria and Carlos Rodriguez officially became their legal parents. Elena and her siblings officially became their family. And Ethan, Sophie, and Lucas officially stopped being orphans, running from separation. They became something else. Survivors who had found their way home. The Rodriguez house was everything Ethan hadn't dared to hope for. It was loud, Maria cooked enormous meals for her now 7 children. Carlos worked as a mechanic and taught all the kids how to fix things. The biological Rodriguez children welcomed them without resentment, as if adding 3 more siblings was the most natural thing in the world. Sophie thrived in school. Lucas recovered from his fever and became inseparable from the Rodriguez boys. And Ethan, for the first time since his parents' death, allowed himself to be a child again instead of a guardian. But he never forgot what Daniel Carter had done. 1 year after the adoption, on the anniversary of finding the buried bus, Ethan asked Carlos to drive him back to the canyon where it all began. The bus was still there, half buried, waiting patiently for the next child who might need it. Ethan climbed inside with a fresh notebook and added a new entry below his original message. "We're safe now. We're loved. We're together. Your refuge saved our lives, Mr. Carter. We're going to spend the rest of our lives making sure your kindness wasn't wasted." The Miller family, Ethan, Sophie, and Lucas. He left the notebook open and climbed back out into the sunlight. Carlos was waiting by the truck, understanding, without words, why this place mattered. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Ethan looked back at the buried bus one last time. Home. A word that meant something again. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." 5 years later, Ethan graduated high school at the top of his class. He gave a speech about resilience, family, and the strangers who become saviors. He spoke about Daniel Carter and the buried bus. He spoke about the importance of preparing for children in crisis, about building systems that keep families together instead of tearing them apart. Sophie and Lucas sat in the front row with Maria and Carlos, the entire Rodriguez family beaming with pride. After the ceremony, a woman approached Ethan. She introduced herself as Daniel Carter's sister, someone who had lost touch with him years before his death, but had recently learned about the refuge he had built. "He never told anyone in the family what he was doing," she said, tears in her eyes. "I had no idea, but I wanted to thank you for honoring his memory." She handed Ethan a photograph. It showed Daniel Carter with his 3 children, taken just months before the fire. They were laughing, building a snowman, completely unaware of the tragedy that would come. "He loved them so much," she said, "and I think he would have loved knowing that his grief became someone else's salvation." Ethan studied the photograph, memorizing the faces of children he would never meet, but who had shaped his entire life. "He saved us," Ethan said simply. "We'll make sure other people know what he did." That promise became Ethan's mission. He went to college on a scholarship, studying social work and child advocacy. He volunteered with organizations that supported sibling groups in foster care. And he began working with Robert Morrison to establish the Daniel Carter Foundation, an organization dedicated to creating more refuges, more support systems, more ways to keep families together. The buried bus remained in the canyon, maintained and restocked regularly by volunteers who understood its purpose. Over the next decade, 4 more families found it. Each time, the bus fulfilled its purpose. Each time, the children left messages in the notebook. Each time, Daniel Carter's legacy expanded. Ethan kept every message, every story, every proof that one man's grief had been transformed into hope for dozens of children. On the 20th anniversary of finding the bus, Ethan returned one final time. He was 28 now, a professional advocate for children's rights, happily married, expecting his first child. Sophie was a teacher, working with at-risk youth. Lucas was studying engineering, already talking about building better emergency shelters for homeless families. All 3 of them had built lives that honored the gift they had been given. Ethan climbed into the buried bus and opened the notebook, now filled with messages from children Daniel Carter would never meet, but had saved nonetheless. He added one final entry. "Mr. Carter, 20 years ago, you saved 3 kids who had nowhere else to go. Today, those kids have saved 23 others. Your children would be proud. We all are. Thank you for teaching us that the best way to heal grief is to become someone else's hope. Rest in peace. You did it. You saved us all." He closed the notebook and stepped out into the Colorado sunshine. The buried bus would wait for the next child who needed it. And somewhere Ethan believed Daniel Carter was watching, finally at peace, knowing that his children's death had not been meaningless. It had become the beginning of something beautiful, a legacy of refuge, a promise that no child who found their way to that buried bus would ever be alone again.